What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Skyrim. A little indie gem I'm sure none of you have ever heard of, given its past decade of multiple releases, several editions, expansions, and an influence that is frankly hard to overstate. But before we get into all that, I do review games after 100% all the time. I'm sure you've heard my usual spiel on that, but in the case of Skyrim, let's do it a little differently, because I have 100% this game multiple times over the years, barring the possible exception of Diablo 2 that I have no idea how many hours I've actually spent with, given the era in which I played it didn't really track playtime. Skyrim is my most played single-player game. It is the last game I bought where, buying the physical edition was actually just how you played it, generally, before things went fully into the digital world. I still have that physical copy even. So across the game's various releases, editions, some of which were on Steam too, both the regular edition and then the special edition, which I've both 100% on Steam. I also played and 100%ed over on the Switch, which I used to take to work with me when I had a normal job. And really, that's not that strange of a story. Many people have played Skyrim as much, if not much more. And that's before you even start talking about things like mods and whatnot. So while Skyrim is a game that you have more than likely heard everything about, and I certainly don't pretend I'm going to add any magical special sauce to the conversation, it is a game I'm extremely familiar with, and I wanted to cover it on the channel eventually, which is what we're doing here, and is why I spared everybody the first impressions video. But with that out of the way, I said that Skyrim's influence can't really be overstated, and chances are you probably know why. The fact that the modding community in particular has given it such incredibly long legs, the fact that even in today's day and age people are still comparing games to a game that came out in 2011, the fact that it is quite possibly the best-selling single-player RPG of all time, though I admit there is a little bit of debate about that. And yet, in spite of those things, all the way in 2025, I would say Skyrim is a game that actually shows its age a fair bit when you play it. People often talk about the previous games like Oblivion, Morrowind, and even farther back than that being difficult to play these days because of their comparison to modern standards. And yet, if you take that same lens minus the mods, Skyrim starts to fall into some of that same category, actually. It's often a little busted. Most of the systems that it used extensively have actually been, I would say, refined, at least independently in other games, even if nothing quite matches the total package here, which is all to basically say it's old and it's finally starting to show, much more than you might think if you actually, again, play it without the mods. But before we dive fully into this, there's one main thing I want to get across. I really enjoy Skyrim for the most part, as you might imagine, with how much I've played it. But it does have two major problems that, in addition to everything else I want to talk about in this video, I want to get across. Skyrim actually has a fair bit of choice. What it does not really have is consequences. Depending on how much of the game you've played, you may or may not know that there's a fair few choices in Skyrim, actually. A lot of the Daedric Quests have choices involved. Choices between who to support in the Civil War, or if anybody at all, which leads to a special main story quest. Do you actually take up the mantle of the Dark Brotherhood and perform their normal quest line, or do you turn them in an unmarked quest that allows you to destroy the Dark Brotherhood? There's a lot of little stuff like that, but outside of that one instance with the Dark Brotherhood, consequences are not something that Skyrim does well. And it really is to the game's detriment, because oftentimes it at the very least takes the weight away from the decisions you are making, because no matter what you actually did there, you're going to get mostly the same reward. But really, that's only one issue that I have with Skyrim. The other is more about its pacing, which kind of influences the other issue. But Skyrim has this really big problem of not taking the time to ever set up a story. Most of the quest lines are really short, and it's, again, to the game's detriment to do it that way, because the game is very clearly trying to rush you from cool moment to cool moment at every turn. And sometimes that works. Exploration is great in Skyrim, but there are other times, especially noticeable in the College of Winterhold, where that questline's a bit of a mess, frankly. But none of that's much of a surprise, because when you just compare the individual quest lines to the ones in just the previous entry, Oblivion, most of them are about a third of the length. So pushing 14 years later, my issues with Skyrim are basically those two things. I think other games have gone on to handle that stuff better, and while Skyrim has an experience that has just quite frankly not been replicated since, as I think most people would agree, it's far from a perfect game, especially when viewed through a modern lens. But realistically, no video about Skyrim would be complete without talking about mods, and of course the Creation Club by extension. So personally, I am playing through this for this review with no mods. I don't usually play with much in the way of mods. However, the Skyrim Special Edition received an Anniversary Edition back in 2021, which added a bunch of Creation Club stuff to the base game, meaning that the version of the game you are most likely to buy these days, if you were to buy it for the first time, say, you turned 18 this year or something, I don't know, you'd probably buy that Special Edition with the Anniversary Edition DLC, which is going to have a bunch of that Creation Club stuff baked in. A lot of that stuff surprisingly replaced a lot of the mods I used to use for Skyrim, things like a backpack mod, a fishing mod, a survival mod. So while I find pretty much everything in the Creation Club to generally be too expensive individually for what it is, when it was all bundled with that Anniversary Edition, it was a decent deal. But then of course there's just regular plain old mods. I don't think Skyrim would be what it is today without the support of the modding community. And while I'm not using any mods, you really just can't talk about Skyrim without talking about the mods. And that is simply because they touch every single aspect of this game. There is very little mods do not touch, from sweeping game overhauls, additions. There are a few games that have essentially been made because they started out as Skyrim mods. So while I am going to be sticking to basically what the base game itself is, do keep in mind there is a mod for anything and everything under the sun when it comes to Skyrim. No matter how niche or strange or how downright inappropriate you think you can get, I promise you there's probably a mod for it. Now, it also unfortunately bears a mention that some of those mods are here basically to fix problems the game has, because even the most up-to-date version of Skyrim, the Anniversary Edition, all that I've just said, still is honestly a pretty buggy experience, from enemies occasionally bugging out and just doing absolutely nothing while you beat them to death, quest triggers breaking and causing quest lines to break. You're still likely to encounter a lot of issues playing Skyrim. Now, luckily most of them are fixable if you're on PC with just the console commands. I haven't run into anything game-breaking in a long time personally, but even in perfect conditions, there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. And that's before we even talk about the fact that occasionally Skyrim gets updates which then breaks all the mods, and then if you're using those mods, it's going to cause you all sorts of headaches. So basically, there's a lot of potential here for errors or problems when playing Skyrim. Now, luckily, almost all of it has a workaround, and the game is so popular that finding a workaround is relatively easy, and mods get updated very quickly, but some of those mods exist to fix said bugs, like the unofficial patch, for instance. So if you're going to play Skyrim at all, I would honestly recommend playing it on PC, where you have access to console commands to fix whatever inevitably is going to go wrong at some point. Now, next up, I actually want to talk about the story and my thoughts on it. Normally, I would save this until after character creation and whatnot, but I'd like to go ahead and get it out of the way because, perhaps unsurprisingly to many people, the main story, like a lot of Bethesda titles, tends to be kind of the least interesting part about it, to be frank. I know people who play Skyrim and just never do the main story at all. And because of the fact that the game continues after the main story, and even the main story of all the DLCs, it really is just kind of a footnote in the larger game. But I will say, personally, I enjoyed the main story a decent bit. It's definitely aging. A lot of the dragons and stuff, which we'll get into, have gotten, I would say, less impressive over the years. It kind of reminds me of when I go back and watch some of my really old videos, and I'm like, wow, that does not sound as good as I remember. But luckily, in spite of that, the main story is largely a vehicle to the more interesting things you can get up to. It often leads you to the various guilds, puts you in touch with the Greybeards, so you can learn all the lore around, of course, the dragon shouts, which are iconic to the game, and then, of course, the dragon fights themselves. But no matter how much you do of it, the first, I would say, opening acts of it are pretty iconic. Of course, waking up on the carriage, having been caught at the border, if you find yourself in prison about to be executed, only for Alduin, Herald of Doomsday, the World Eater, swooping in to inadvertently cause your escape, setting off a chain of events where we find out that we are in fact the last Dragonborn, a mortal with the soul of a dragon, capable of naturally learning their shouts and being an incredibly powerful individual. A pretty hard definition chosen one. But the most interesting bits of the story are what we learn along the way, in my opinion, because this game is set 200 years after the previous entry, Oblivion. Things have changed. There's been a great war. The Aldmeri Dominion has taken over largely most of the continent. having forced the Empire into a treaty which is preventing them from worshipping their god Talos, that is causing everybody to chafe, which has led to civil war in the region of Skyrim, and that's before we get into all the dragons and the greybeards and what it means to shout and learn the various words of power that make up those shouts, because in effect it is dragon speech, and them breathing fire at each other and everything is them actually just having a debate in a way, which is really funny. But all of that cool stuff is often let down by other events, like the fact that we are a dragonborn and we're supposed to be using these shouts, but then, the actual speech tree is really boring. So while I don't want to bore people with a play-by-play of the story, which, honestly, I'm sure many people are fully aware of, I did want to mention a few things about it, in particular that I enjoyed or didn't like for one reason or another. Now, honestly, the things I don't like are largely down to the age of the game. For instance, a relatively early quest where we infiltrate the Aldmeri Dominion's embassy or the Thalmor embassy to get to the bottom of what they know about the dragons reappearing after we meet up with Delphine and learn that she's a member of the Disgraced Blades. And that quest is a quest that I like in theory. It's got a lot of really cool setup, but unfortunately it's let down by a lot of, I would say, poor dialogue and incredibly fast pacing. Like there's no setup to the infiltration. You basically just go get an invitation from somebody, pass off some items, and then show up at the embassy, make a distraction, sneak into the basement, learn what you need to learn, fight a few guys, and then you leave. And then there's other stuff that's just really cool, like descending into Blackreach, finding out as we pursue an Elder Scroll that not only is there a large portion of the map we haven't been to, but that it's incredibly cool at the same time, and is only found by interacting with devices in Dwemer ruins that we may or may not have already been in, only to be greeted by this incredibly crazy space that has the, of course, iconic secret dragon fight. But not only that, if you do a little bit of a sort of digging, you can find out that Blackreach was housing Ethereum, which led to the Ethereum Wars, which is background lore for the Dwemer and stuff in this area, and that sort of incredible moment is backed up by not only environmental storytelling like with the Dwemer that I mentioned in the Ethereum Wars, but also just the fact that what you're actively doing down there is really cool. And when you compare stuff like that to the Diplomatic Immunity quest, you can kind of see what I was talking about with that pacing issue, where they are very, very quickly burning through plot points to try to get you to the cool thing as fast as possible, and they don't really give you any build-up to it. Because while it takes a little while to get to the point of the story where you have to go get that dragon scroll from Blackreach, you're most of the way through the main story once that happens. But then there's the actual dragons and the shouts and everything that make us dragonborn. This is the kind of thing that I thought was really, really cool in 2011, but it's pretty old news these days. On one hand, way back then, I was, surprised to see things like dragons like actively moving and flying around really impressively, and yet here in 2025, that just looks straight up dated, and as a result of that, less impressive. Now, the shouts have actually remained pretty cool. You can learn all sorts of shouts, and those will have different effects, and they're fun to play around with if you lean into them. And all of that to say that while Skyrim is an aging game, I do think the story and the way a lot of it is presented is perhaps what has aged the least well. It's still interesting in terms of like lore and concepts if you're especially into the Elder Scrolls, and it has a great start in my opinion, but it quickly falls into that trap of trying to rush you very quickly to the cool part, and that's where it kind of falls flat on its face for me. But let's be honest, the main story's never really been the big focus of Bethesda titles anyway, so let's keep it moving. From there, the thing I would like to talk about is, of course, character creation, followed by the various progression systems of the game. So character creation is a bit different from their previous entries, and that's because they've taken out a lot of the more upfront RPG elements. There's still a lot of that later, but at character creation, it's mostly just cosmetic. We're going to pick what race we want to play as from the 10 available, and then of course, what we want that character to look like, and right at character creation, that is mostly it, though we do get racial bonuses from what race we happen to play here. Now, this is because, unlike previous entries, they've taken out classes, attributes, their signs. We don't really define any of that at the beginning of the game. We sort of just start out as a blank slate character. With a few minor exceptions. We do get some passives for just picking one race or the other, but in comparison to previous entries, these are relatively mild. Now, they do still have some use cases. This time around, I wanted to play an unarmed build because I hadn't really done a full playthrough of that previously, and the best for that is typically the Khajiit because they get the most just base unarmed damage. So, in a situation like that, you might want to pick a specific character. If you happen to be playing on survival mode, if I'm not mistaken, Orcs or Khajiit are generally considered the best because they get some resistances to things on survival mode. But beyond those things, most of this stuff is going to to outdate itself by just a few levels into the game, at which point they become largely useless. For instance, Khajiit get Night Eye, which helps them see in the dark, but this game doesn't really get so dark that you would ever need to use that anyway. And then, for instance, like Argonians and Wood Elves actually get resist disease, but diseases are so light in this game, that is to say their effects are so minimal and they are so easily cured that it's just irrelevant. Now, that's not to say it's all bad. As an example, we have the Orc. They get a Berserker Rage ability that allows them to do double damage for 60 seconds as an example, as well as taking half. Red Guards get Adrenaline Rush, which gives them stamina, and because of the way power attacks work, you only need 1 stamina to actually use a power attack, which means that for about a minute there, they just get infinite power attacks. And while those aren't terrible, they're also not like crazy either, because again, stamina is not really that bad when it comes to power attacks, because you only need the 1. So while it will make it regenerate faster if you're a Red Guard using that power, it's not so astronomically better than the base that it's really worth specifically playing for that reason. And then for Berserker Rage, you get that double damage, and while that's useful on like legendary difficulty, it's just really not going to matter on the others because you're eventually going to outlevel enemies anyway. So simply put, there are racial bonuses, but they are so inconsequential, I would honestly just not worry about them 99% of the time. So post-character creation, what can we do then? Well, this is where some of the overhauls become immediately apparent, because rather than having to level up skills, which then affected your bonuses to attributes, and you kind of wanted to balance that against what you were fighting, especially in Oblivion, and what the level scaling of the enemies were doing. In Skyrim, you don't have to worry about any of that, which, let's be real, was probably in large part a response to Oblivion's reception in terms of how its character leveling worked. And I'm not getting into all that here, but I have reviewed that game if you'd like to go take a look at it. It's a lot. But simply put, progression in Skyrim comes down to a level by doing system. We have a whole host of skills, and as we use and apply them, they will level up. Each level up of an individual skill contributes XP to your main level, and once you've leveled up enough skills, your main level goes up, and then when you get that main level up, you'll choose between increasing health, stamina, or magicka, which increases your base pool of 100. We'll also get a perk point to spend in one of the perk trees for all of these various skills. Now, these perk trees are so-so. You can tell it was a sort of first draft effort, if I'm being frank. I do think their later games since this have actually done a better job with the perk trees. Fallout 4 just straight away has a pretty good one, especially compared to this, and even Starfield took a better approach, frankly. But why do I say that? Well, basically, it's because these perks range from outright terrible to incredibly useful, and you're not going to know that necessarily by what the game is telling you, because what the game is telling you is either sometimes just wrong, or it's not giving you all of the context. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at the Khajiit racial bonus as an example. It says that our unarmed claw attacks do 15 points of damage, but that's not true. It does 12. But bringing it back around to the perks in particular, there are perks that increase your crit chance. But if you've played a lot of Skyrim, you may very well know that critical damage or attacks in general are basically useless because of the way they are calculated. They add very, very little damage to any actual attack. But the game doesn't explain that to you, so you might spend perk points on them thinking they're useful, but they are not. Meanwhile, other perks still have unique and interesting effects, like Necromage. Necromage increases the magic effects on the undead, but the thing is, you can be undead via things like becoming a vampire lord, and then having Necromage makes your spells stronger as a result. So that's sort of an interesting interaction there that the game doesn't really tell you about. Other perks are so just inherently useful, it's hard not to take them. Like, for instance, we can pick up the Light Step perk from the Sneak tree. This effectively allows you to walk over traps without triggering them. There are a lot of traps in the game. That will make your life easier, but if you're looking for more direct effectiveness, the Max Level Enchanting perk, which takes a little bit of work to get, sure lets you put 2 enchantments on an individual item when you add an enchantment to it, meaning that you've effectively doubled its effectiveness while being able to put a max level enchantment on it, which is of course insanely effective. That is useful for everyone in every scenario. Meanwhile, trees like speech and lockpicking are incredibly disappointing. So as I mentioned, dragon shouts are basically speech. That's how dragons talk to each other. But the actual speech tree for our dragonborn who's supposed to be using those shouts has little of interest. It's basically all your standard shops and investment type stuff, and while there's a couple useful perks in there, like being able to sell anything to anyone, it's hardly anything that's required. Now, the most disappointing tree to me personally is actually lockpicking, because you can pick every lock in this game without taking a single perk in the lockpicking tree. None of them are hidden behind difficulty. You can pick a master lock right from the beginning of the game, and while it might be a little bit difficult once you get that skill leveled up, even without the perks to actually pick those locks, it's not hard. But assuming you don't just want the perks that make the actual lock picking a little better, even just the other perks are terrible. Like, you get one called Wax Key that gives you a copy of the key for the lock you just picked, but if I can pick the lock, I don't need the key, do I? You could argue convenience in a few cases, but it's largely useless. There's one that increases the gold, but because of the calculation, you're actually getting very little gold from that perk. There's one that makes your lock picks unbreakable, except you'll probably have 100 of them just laying around because they're everywhere. So that's what I mean when I say that these progression or perk trees are really a mixed bag. They did better work with later entries here. Or, games that they've made. Not so much entries in the Elder Scrolls series, obviously. But still, a few other things to mention. Now, sometimes we can get hidden active effects just by playing the game. Some quests and things will lead to rewards that give you extra persistent magical effects. Not all that different from taking a perk that will do just random things according to what you picked up, like increasing your healing done, that kind of thing. But before we move on a little bit, let's talk about some specifics. So, once upon a time, their max level, I want to say, was like 80 before the legendary edition of the game dropped. That actually sort of removed the level cap and allowed you to get as many perks as you possibly could, or keep leveling until you couldn't, because that version of the game allowed you to, once you have reached level 100 in a skill, cause it to become a legendary, which is to say reset all your progress, but keep all the perk points you earned from leveling that up. This allows us to continue leveling by resetting the trees, because max level previously was just, whatever level it was when you maxed all of your skills. But with this legendary system, you can continue to level. However, even with that system, there is no real benefit to leveling up beyond 252. That's because that is going to give you all of the perks. You can keep leveling after that still, but there's not much of a point, especially since the level scaling will have definitely stopped. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but most of the game stops kind of scaling to you after level 50 or so. Like, most things are kind of designed with a level 50 in-game in mind. And while there are some things that scale past that, all of it stops by level 150. And even then, they were only rare exceptions to begin with. But that is a way you can continue leveling and getting perks for all of this stuff if you want to just continue playing the game for one reason or another, which is probably as good a time as any to mention about the leveling exploits. Very common knowledge that there are ways to sort of grind up these skills and get very leveled up very, very quickly. The only thing that you really have to do if you do that is make sure that you also grind up a combat skill, because as your main level increases, so does the scaling around you. And if you are not actively increasing your combat effectiveness alongside those exploits, you're in for a pretty rude awakening afterwards. Now, another form of progression, though, comes from shouts. So we can learn various dragon shouts. We're going to pick these up from the various word walls we encounter that are scattered all throughout the world in the DLCs, and these teach us the words of power, of which 3 make up a dragon shout. But each word that we learn gives us a better and better version of that shout. However, just knowing the word is not enough. We also have to unlock them. This is where absorbing the souls of dragons comes in. Every time we kill a dragon, that's going to give us a dragon soul to unlock a word of power with, basically granting us understanding of its meaning so we can properly use it. There are a lot of dragon shouts, quite a few of them that do all sorts of different stuff, ranging from very useful to kind of insignificant. Slow time, for instance, which slows down enemies so you can beat them to death, fully maxed out, is really good, actually. But others, like fire or ice breath, they're fine, but I find their damage to be a little underwhelming, whereas things like elemental or dragon aspect, which you can pick up, are really strong because they increase your combat effectiveness outright. But then, other stuff like Aura Whisper, which will show you the location of enemies, or Throw Voice, which will let you distract enemies, I don't find particularly useful. But then the final part of progression is just straight up gear. Now, just like the games before it, there's various tiers of gear for light or heavy, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But you gotta start by deciding what kind of gear you want to use, because this determines, of course, what skills you're leveling up. Light or heavy armor, as an example, they usually get bonuses for wearing a full set of each, but until you get sufficiently skilled up with it, heavy armor actually slows you down quite a bit. It eats into your stamina, whereas light armor will be, of course, easier to use. But much like the previous games, once you get that up to max level, it's all basically the same and cosmetic anyway. anyway, especially once you start out leveling enemies. Not that the game is really ever that hard unless you're making it to begin with, but still. Then of course there's all the various different weapon types you can use, and that's important because they do actually all play a little bit differently. Obviously everybody loves the stealth archer, but picking what equipment you're using determines what skills you are using, thus what you are progressing in terms of your actual levels up and the perks that are available to you with the minimum skill caps and whatnot, which is probably pretty obvious, but still. But nonetheless, this gear can either have innate enchantments or it can have enchantments that you put on it via enchanting and the like. First, you'll have to learn those effects by finding items with them and disenchanting them, which gives you the ability to enchant them onto other pieces of gear, and that can be incredibly overpowered once you get the dual enchantment perk. But it's also possible to create gear via things like smithing, but that gear can then be improved by taking it to, say, a workbench or a sharpening stone, and this will actually make them, of course, better by spending a little bit of resources to improve their armor or damage. Now, the thing is, that can be abused a little bit, which is a well-known sort of, I guess, exploit. You can essentially use things like alchemy, enchanting, and smithing to make your gear better. You can make potions that increase enchanting or blacksmithing. You can increase your enchanting specifically to then make enchanted gear that increases other things like smithing or alchemy, and sort of round and round it goes until you have really high attributes. But your armor does actually reach a sort of cap in how much armor it can reduce, which I believe is like 80%. But there aren't, however, caps to weapon damage, meaning that weapons can use this glitch to deal as much damage as you can make it do, but obviously there is a sort of practical limit to that, in that I believe most enemies have far less than, say, 2,000 health, so there is that. Or you could be like me and decide to go unarmed, which is an underwhelming damage source comparatively to a lot of the different weapon types you can make for yourself. But even when you do something like that, the game is not particularly challenging. So in large part, it's not super necessary to do any of that. And when you combine all of those things together, there really is a lot of different ways to build a character in Skyrim. You can take advantage of various exploits to really push that over the top, for instance, or just hone in on individual interesting effects that make it fun to play around with. But really, a lot of the joy of that experience is simply finding something that works for you and playing the game in your way, which the game, because of its approach to these things, is largely freeform in letting you do. Which brings us to a decently important point, which is that Skyrim actually removed quite a bit of stuff from the previous games. There are less magic trees, less magic overall, no spell crafting, just all sorts of stuff like that. So if you've played the previous games, there is a significant amount that you could say is missing or that was removed from the series. Now, this was much worse upon release because updates and things like that, the Creation Club content that is bundled into the Anniversary Edition now really does expand a lot of that stuff. For instance, magic was pretty underwhelming for a while, to me at least, because of the way it capped out. But one of the Creation Clubs sort of fixes that problem by adding more and interesting spells, even letting you go fully into the necromancer side of things. And even things like armor variety was initially pretty limited, but now with all of these content additions, there's like 50 or 60 armor sets in the game that you can actually get. But nonetheless, as a point of critique, there are some limitations on these things. And again, I actually do think Bethesda has done better with their other titles after this in terms of weapon variety. So for Elder Scrolls 6, which they are currently working on at the time of this video, I would sincerely hope that they plan on expanding this stuff and not reducing it further. Because while Skyrim eventually, especially with the help of mods, got to a point where this wasn't a big deal, or at least as big of a deal, I generally want to see sequels expand and iterate, not do less. So while the gameplay of Skyrim improved a lot from those previous entries, it also left a lot by the wayside as well, which is where I think a lot of the critique of some of its RPG systems comes in. But there's still a lot you can do there and some fun to be had for sure. Which finally brings us to the gameplay and world section. So a lot to cover here, but the main point I want to get across here is that exploration is really king in Skyrim. They do a fantastic job of setting you up to explore and discover the world. It's very easy to basically go anywhere and discover either a quest or lore or an interesting thing happening in the environment that they're telling you a story by placing all these items around. It really is the highlight of what Skyrim does, and they are incredibly good at doing that, combining it with how you want to play the game, which creates this overall fun gameplay loop. And while I I fully admit Skyrim, even as fun as it is, isn't going to be for everybody. I think its extreme mass appeal has largely come down from that, which is why you can ignore huge parts of the content and still have a satisfying experience with the game overall. Because that core loop is just really, really good, of running somewhere, finding something, exploring it, getting loot, leveling up, putting that into tangible, real improvement, only to go then do it again after you've been to town, picked up quests, etc. You're just kind of always doing something in Skyrim, and it is satisfying, especially on a first playthrough, which is why, 14 years later, I can still remember my very first experience with the Falmer, which was actually at a place called the Frostflow Lighthouse, which has this really fantastic miscellaneous quest associated with it, where you find a family murdered, only to sort of discover that they were having problems with something in the basement, and then you go down there, and it turns out that the twisted form of the snow elves, the Falmer, actually broke in and murdered the family and took them in. But what's more, once you clear out that dungeon, you can find the remains of the father of that family, and a note will tell you what he wanted done with his remains. And while it is not required of you at all, if you go take his remains up to the lighthouse and sort of cremate the guy that way, you get a hidden perk for doing that. And it was just a fantastic little quest that is kind of burned into my memory because of how well that moment was set up by just me finding and discovering something on my own in this world. But with that little side story out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about some of the specifics of how this works. So this is actually where I'm going to talk about difficulty, which might seem like a strange place, but Skyrim and difficulty are kind of odd because the game can be difficult if you want it to be. It does have several different difficulty modes, but most of what they affect is your damage dealt and damage taken. On legendary difficulty, the max difficulty, you deal a quarter of your normal damage while taking 3 times your normal damage, which obviously requires you to play a lot more defensively and be much more patient as a result. It's still possible to break the game even on that point, and even on that difficulty, you are still eventually going to outlevel things if you play long enough. It is nonetheless worth knowing. But the thing that I think is much more important when it comes to Skyrim is how it handles its level scaling, because level scaling in Oblivion especially was very, very poor, and they've done a much better job with it since, and that started with Skyrim. So I actually think later games from here iterated upon this even more and made it feel better. Skyrim is honestly probably a bit of an overcorrection where the game is very lacking in difficulty 90% of the time. So let's talk about some of that. So the game does use a level scaling system. That is to say, the world sort of scales to you as you level up, but there are some general rules to this. For starters, even leveled enemies have a maximum that they can level to you. There is a cap put on that, and a lot of enemies just have a set level generally. There are some enemies that will scale with your player level, but even then to a maximum of like 150. I think there's like a single exception to that, which gives it a nonsense amount of health, but it's from a Radiant quest you're probably not going to want to do. But generally, very early in the game, you want to avoid the mountainous regions. That's because the dungeons that you find in those regions have a higher level scale than the rest of the game. Most dungeons of the title have a sort of set range that the enemies there can spawn in at. And once you get over that range, that dungeon then of course becomes trivial by design because the enemies there are just going to be beneath you in terms of your actual level. But on the flip side of that, if I go to a place that is above my level as a low level, that will have higher level enemies than you can probably deal with. This ensures a few things. For starters, the fact that the sort of infinitely scaling enemies of Oblivion are no more. They have limits in place, so that kind of thing doesn't happen where every enemy turns into a giant tank past a certain point. But it's also generally a bad idea to go to high-level places early because everything can and will kill you very, very easily. But if you're willing to play within that system, the game is just not really a difficult endeavor because it is, by and large, a power fantasy with very little in the way of consequences, as I mentioned. Next up, for gameplay and world, I want to talk about the new elements that have been added since launch, as well as just generally hidden stuff. So there are a whole host of new elements added into the game via the Creation Club. I guess new might not exactly be the word in 2025, but you know, additions to the base game, I suppose you could say, with things like, say, the fishing system, allowing you to, of course, catch fish and find items and whatnot. And then, of course, all the new quests and additions therein, such as the quest that sees you dealing with the return of the Mythic Dawn from Oblivion and even going into a plane of Oblivion called Deadlands from that game. Some of this I remember doing when it came out, and then a couple of these quests actually caught me by surprise because I don't remember doing them at all, and for a game that you've played as much as I have with this, it's nice to occasionally be reminded that the game is very large And with all of those updates, there are occasionally things you either don't remember so well or genuinely just haven't seen, and that's going to lead to things like finding a small quest here and there that you don't remember. And while sure, the outcomes of those might not necessarily be anything grand, usually just something to your benefit, like the handcrafted player homes or new pet followers that you can bring around, including a goblin even. And then even all these years later, you have all of this content that you can explore, which I would have to imagine would be overwhelming if you were new to it at this point. But there's still some other stuff to mention. Namely, survival mode for starters. So the game does have survival mode via a creation club with the Anniversary Edition. I don't love survival mode for Skyrim. I think it's fine. It's also just not, in my opinion, a game that was really built for a survival mode, so it feels a little weird. Like, for instance, a lot of the game is clearly built around fast travel, and survival mode disabling that makes it a bit of a pain. And while you can use things like the carriages, doing stuff like the Thieves Guild questline, for instance, without being able to fast travel is just a nightmare. But beyond that, it does include just kind of your regular things, a hunger meter, fatigue or exhaustion. You can get cold. Skyrim is actually a cold place. Your health doesn't regen naturally. Diseases are more impactful. So I kind of see what they were trying to do with survival mode, but I just don't enjoy it personally. But it is a thing that you can do. Now, probably as good a place as any to talk about the game's sort of Radiant AI, which is fine, but again, I don't think it has the charm of Oblivion's Radiant AI. But nonetheless, probably does work a little better overall. And this is going to see your interactions with various NPCs reflected. So if you upset somebody, they might send hired thugs after you. If somebody dies due to a random attack by, say, a dragon, you might very well earn an inheritance, provided that that person actually liked you. If certain characters are killed off, you might see others take over their shops, things like that. Now, as with most of their games at this point, many NPCs are marked as essential. Now, a lot of people have gripes about the essential NPC system, but I do kind of see why they do it this way. And that is primarily because you have this Radiant system dictating the actions and schedules of all these NPCs, but then you throw dragons that can randomly attack, sometimes even in towns, mind you, and that's going to prevent NPCs dying and questlines getting broken without any input from you, the player. But I will say that personally, I would love to see them implement some sort of system where these characters could die if it was directly related to you and what you did, but would probably be hard to implement without being exploitable. But nonetheless, this would allow you to actually make some choices and deal with NPCs in a way that is unique to you without necessarily seeing entire questlines blocked off because a dragon got too close to Whiterun. Since for whatever reason, anytime a dragon attacks, every peasant in the world thinks their little iron dagger is the way to go, rather than running for cover. But while the Radiant AI system is here, I do think it feels a little more safe in comparison to Oblivion's, which felt really bizarre and experimental at times, which, sure, sometimes it didn't work, I would say, all that well, but it was memorable to be certain, and I never really got that feeling from Skyrim outside of just, interacting with the generality of the sandbox that it provides, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, just a preference thing on my end more than anything. But realistically, what I would say most people remember from the Radiant AI system in Skyrim is likely the Radiant Quest. That is to say, infinitely repeatable quests that you can get from various quest givers that make sure you always have something to do. The problem with this is that because they are effectively generated quests utilizing a few different parameters, they're incredibly boring. But they do exist if that's something you want to do, I suppose. But speaking of the opposite of boring, we actually have the Daedric Quests. So I don't know if this is a hot take per se, but it is an opinion I have. I think Skyrim does the best job of implementing the Daedric Quests directly into the game world. In all of the previous iterations, they were a bit lacking. So you have games like Morrowind, where there's only a few Daedric Quests, really. You don't see all of them represented. And the ones that are there are pretty good, there's just not a lot of them. And then in Oblivion, you get all your Daedric quests by going to their statue and seeking them out. Whereas in Skyrim, you can run into Daedric quests simply by interacting with the world, such as in Markarth, you can run into a Vigilant of Stendarr investigating a haunted house, and that leads to a Daedric quest. Or famously in Whiterun, you can in fact take up a sort of drinking contest with Sam, only to wake up on the other side of the world map from an all-night bender, and then you have to track track the guy down when you earn a reward for a particular item. So while the individual contents of some of these quests I think is certainly up for debate, I do really enjoy the way they were implemented into the base world here. Some of them are especially memorable too, like for instance, joining up with a cannibal cult is always a fun time, or discerning the transmundane for Hermaeus Mora. But the main thing I actually wanted to talk about when it comes to the Daedric Quests are a lot of them actually do present you with a choice, but as with many cases in this game where you are presented with choices, it just doesn't really matter. So for instance, we have the quest with Azura's Star. We have to find Azura's Star, a soul gem that can hold many souls over without being destroyed, which is useful for enchanting items which require soul energy trapped in soul gems. But this quest has a choice where you can get a normal version or a broken version that allows you to trap human souls, which it normally will not do. The choice here is basically just pissing off Azura or not, but outside of that little narrative piece, functionally, it just doesn't really matter. So yeah, sure, Azura's Star with the busted version will get you those black soul gems from humans, which is the best kind of soul. But soul gems aren't rare in this game. You can just go buy grand soul gems, which are in effect the exact same thing as a human soul gem anyway. So the only real benefit to making that choice in a way that pisses off Azura is you get a slightly more convenient way to get the equivalent of a grand soul in a game where you can just buy them, and what's more, you don't really have a lot of use for your gold anyway, and you're likely to end the game with hundreds of thousands of it unspent. So while I do like the way these quests were implemented, they often present choices that are just not really something that matters much. At worst, you might not get the Daedric artifact if you don't complete the quest in a certain way, but generally, because of the way gearing and progression works, the Daedric artifacts aren't that good comparatively to gear you could make for yourself anyway, so it's not like some great loss, which to me is where the problems with Skyrim really show their face, in that it is how the game is basically concerned about letting you do whatever you want, whenever you want, with no consequences or detriments as a result of that. We see that from everything from the way they've made character building to the way they handle these choices in this game. And if anything at all gets addressed in Elder Scrolls 6, that is the biggest part of it to me. Whether or not you liked Starfield, it did actually handle some of this stuff in a much better way, especially in terms of character progression and whatnot. That felt much more impactful and was a much more interesting system than we see at play here in Skyrim. Even if the world itself and exploration especially was lackluster, which was my own complaint with it as well, even though I did enjoy that game more than most. The exploration was pretty inarguably lacking, which is not something you could say of Skyrim as an example, so kind of did a flip-flop on that one. But nonetheless, it wouldn't be a Skyrim video if we didn't talk about the various guilds of the game. There are 4 sort of primary guilds you can join, and there's the Civil War faction, and there's minor stuff like the Bard's College. Minor stuff like the Bard's College is basically cut content, if I'm not mistaken, where they wanted to do something more but they just couldn't, so you can join the Bard's College in Solitude, but really there's only a couple of quests and it's all a bit underwhelming, though it does give you some decent skill bonuses. I believe the cut content thing also applies to the Civil War, which is pretty underwhelming. There's a civil war going on in Skyrim between the Stormcloaks and the Empire, and you can pick a side and help them ultimately win that civil war if you want to get involved at all. This has a lot to do with the current state of the Empire and the Great War that was mentioned and the fact that we're 200 years after Oblivion. This is fantastic lore stuff. And honestly, I think when it comes to the Elder Scrolls 6, the consequences or what is chosen as the result of this event is probably going to be the most impactful on a next game if they don't choose to just throw it far into the future. But I say that knowing full well that the quest line is pretty boring. Like 1 or 2 quests at the beginning are kind of neat, but then after that they basically just devolve into a few fights with an underwhelming amount of troops kind of just hacking at each other until the game says, okay, that's enough. And then you do that until you take over all the territory for your faction. So the Civil War is underwhelming. It's the kind of thing that has the potential to be really cool, but with the way they've approached it here, it just kind of isn't. Which brings us to the main guilds. So let's start with the companions. So they are in the first major town of Whiterun that you're going to find yourself in, which is almost certainly not by mistake because they are in effect a version of the Fighters Guild. We're going to do a lot of fighting then as a result of this in some quests that explain the lore of Ysgramor and his 500 companions and how that has descended into the modern guild of today and how they make their home in a repurposed boat known as Jorvaskr. What's more though, as you get going, you find out that the companions are opposed with the Silver Hand, who are actually werewolf hunters because the inner circle of the companions are werewolves. In order to complete this quest line, they have to turn you into one. Now, initially when the game came out, this kinda sucked. The werewolf was just bad. With the release of Dawnguard, they revamped both the werewolf and the vampire lord was added, I guess, but the skill trees were added in so you could improve these forms and make them better as you used them. I still wouldn't use them over a normal sort of gameplay experience, to be honest, but they're not completely useless now, so that's definitely an improvement. Nonetheless, though, the companion's main goal as a story really is all about curing one of their main members of the lycanthropy curse so he can rest in Sovngarde instead of Hircine's hunting grounds. But while that's fine, I actually think the main sort of goal of the companions is showing your character around. So they introduce this place right in the first major place you go, and then you then travel with the companions to a whole bunch of locations, get a bunch of gear under your belt for free, potentially a new cool werewolf form. So it's very obvious that this is a sort of starter guild intended to help you get on your feet while also giving you access to things like trainers, which can increase your levels in various cases. And then after that story's over, you can do a few more quests to actually empower your werewolf further by picking up like totems and stuff that you can choose between that give your werewolf form extra powers, which isn't a bad time. And then you can even cure some other members of lycanthropy if you want. So all in all, the companions is solid. It's not terrible. It's not amazing. It's decent. But speaking of terrible, we have the Mages Guild, or the College of Winterhold. I've mentioned this once or twice over the years, but there are very few things about Skyrim that I like less than the Mages Guild here, or again, the College of Winterhold, which is technically a different thing. You'll have to forgive me. But the college is the epitome of this game's problems. It takes absolutely no time to tell you the story of this like college campus sort of like learning magic on the fly vibe, and immediately throws you into, here's the Eye of Magnus, the world's gonna end, the Psijic Order is trying to help you but also won't actually help you. It's like 5 quests long. They're constantly throwing these huge concepts at you and alongside dungeons that are frankly way too long. It's pretty poorly written, quite frankly, and the parts of it that are cool just aren't enough to carry the rest of it, frankly. And the reward for doing all of that is basically access to magical trainers on top of the Archmage's Quarters, which has a couple unique things about it, but that's about it. You don't get spell crafting like we did previously, and you can complete the entire thing while knowing basically 0 magic. In fact, in order to enter the College of Winterhold, all you have to do is cast a single spell, which is typically one from a pool of potential spells that they might require of you, but they are determined you're going to cast that one spell, which is at least funny because the persuasion option to bypass that check is, for whatever reason, like one of the hardest checks in the game, which was especially funny given the context of it, that they don't even need you to be a mage, to be honest. So, simply put, I think while some of the concepts are neat, the Mages or the College of Winterhold has just the worst quest line because not only is it going way too fast for its own good, it also just doesn't really require you to be a mage or evoke the feelings of being a mage in any way, shape, or form. It just fundamentally fails at the thing it is trying to do, which is why I dislike it so much. Now, once you're done with the actual quest lines, there are other things to do. Like, for instance, if you max out your magic skills, you can come here and do like special quests for that particular school of magic, which will give you some extra effects. Like, for instance, conjuration, you'll get permanent versions of some of your summons that last until they die, rather than timing out after a little while. So stuff like that is neat, and concepts like the Augur of Dunlane are really cool, but man, none of it is handled well. Now, luckily, that saves the best two for last, the Thieves Guild and the Dark Brotherhood. I don't mind these so much. The Thieves Guild is actually pretty good. I don't really have a lot of complaints there outside of their base being a little annoying to navigate, maybe, and some of the characters being a little silly, sure, but the Dark Brotherhood I simultaneously enjoy a lot, but I also don't think it quite lives up to how great the Dark Brotherhood was in Oblivion. But first, let's start with the Thieves Guild. There's various reasons you might join up with this guild, but you're going to find by simply going to Riften. They pretty much all but shove it in your face as part of the main story, if nothing else. And the Thieves Guild is down on its luck, so you're going to start helping them turn that around by, of course, thieving, or just, muscling people out on the streets. This eventually leads to a conspiracy with one of the Thieves Guild's main benefactors, Maven Blackbriar, and some business opponent of hers that has been trashing her entire operation. Getting to the bottom of this leads you to find that Carlia, an ex-guild member, has actually been setting up these problems for the guild, because the current guild leader, Mercer Frey, actually killed her lover, Gallus, who was, with Mercer Frey and Carlia, collectively known as the Trio of Nightingales, a sort of splinter group inside of the Thieves Guild that represent the Daedric Prince of Nocturnal. Mercer Frey betrayed this union, stole the skeleton key, which unlocks any lock, including metaphysical ones, and is trying to sell the guild down the river as a result of this. You have to kill him, take the key back to Nocturnal, get your powers, and along the way, we have a bunch of really great quests, to be honest. I love infiltrating a Golden Glow estate, finding the crazy guy raising the Skeever army under the Haunting Brew meadery, where we are trying to poison some brew so a captain takes notice and ruins the business operation there. There's a lot going on in the Thieves Guild, and I like 95% of it. It gets a little weird with Nocturnal at the end, but that would be my only complaint. And, compared to stealing an Elder Scroll of the last game, it doesn't quite match the grandiosity of it, but overall, I enjoy it. Now, with what you can do after and what you'll need to do to become the actual master of the Thieves Guild is restore it to its former glory, because unlike the other guilds, there's actually more you have to do to be named the leader of it here, and this is done by taking on jobs, successfully completing them, and then doing the special jobs that arise from that. Basically, you can be sent on jobs to steal and thieve your way across the major holds of Skyrim here. Each job you do in every one of those territories is calculated, so once we've done 5 jobs for each hold, we get the special job for that place, and once we've done that, we get an extra merchant inside the Ragged Flagon, or the sort of thieves' headquarters. But what's more, as we complete these jobs, we'll also start to notice that the Thieves Guild starts coming back to life. Things start improving, they start getting better furniture. The place just starts looking nicer in general, and what's more, on each of the main missions, we can steal special curiosities that we can sell back to the guild that are then displayed alongside the improvements from doing all those Radiant jobs, which then kind of gives you a little display case of all your successful thieveries inside the Thieves Guild, and I enjoyed that a lot. And when you put all of that together, it's a decent quest line that I enjoyed, admittedly the first half more than the back half, but it also focuses primarily on being a thief of some sort, even if it gets a little weird and supernatural towards the end, but that's fantasy games for you, I suppose. But then of course the Dark Brotherhood, everybody's favorite assassins, so they've also fallen on hard times and have no listener after the Dark Brotherhood was all but wiped out in the last 200 years since Oblivion. Prior to starting it, we can meet one of the main characters, Cicero, having some problems north of Whiterun, but we don't know that at the time, at least in theory. But eventually we're going to hear rumors of a kid performing the Black Sacrament in Windhelm. When we find him, he's going to send us to go kill his orphanage headmistress, so to speak, who was terrorizing all the children there. You're going to do that. It's very easy. Everyone hates her, so nobody even cares, and you don't get a bounty for killing her in broad daylight. Once you turn that quest in, however, the next time you sleep, you're going to be abducted by Astrid, the head of the Dark Brotherhood, who is very upset that you stole one of their contracts. And she's going to force you to kill one of 3 people in this room you're in order to join the Dark Brotherhood, or, pay your debt back, as she says, but that leads to joining the Dark Brotherhood. But here's the thing, you have an unmarked option here. You could just attack and kill Astrid, leave, and then pick up a quest to go report the Dark Brotherhood, and then wipe them out entirely instead of doing their quest line, which I thought was a really cool option because it's one of the few times the game actively prevents you from doing content by making a different decision. And I think that's great, to be honest. But once you actually join the Dark Brotherhood, you'll start taking on various contracts that start off a little slow, but the next thing you know, you're contracted to assassinate the Emperor himself and have to set about doing a bunch of jobs to facilitate that assassination. That is, before you get betrayed, ultimately by one of your own, all because you were named listener by Cicero, who ultimately shows up with the Night Mother who speaks to you, which is what qualifies you as the listener, and then gives you the secret phrase to give to Cicero, which is her keeper, which is your official confirmation as the listener. But not wanting to give up her power, Astrid betrays all of you, sells you out to the guards, only for that to backfire and the Brotherhood to be destroyed yet again, leaving only a few members, and you, as the listener, have to pull that back from the ashes, successfully assassinate the Emperor, which is an incredible quest, and it's really great. So I will say some of the characters for this one can be a little campy, but for the most part, I really like this one. I will say it is not quite as good as the Dark Brotherhood in Oblivion, but I still think they did a pretty good job with it. And then, of course, after all that's done, you can continue to murder side contract targets, which are pretty easy. And then there's also a Radiant quest that becomes available via the Night Mother from your new sanctuary, which acts as a sort of player home that you get to set up, which is always pretty sweet. But that's pretty much it for factions and the gameplay and the world. But hopefully from all of that, you saw just how massive this game can truly be. In fact, just gathering footage for this particular review and going over all of it wound up being like 70 hours worth of game time. And that was with me knowing where everything was and how to do it. So while every faction I wouldn't say lands, and if anything I'd like to see them iterate upon that formula rather than continuing to do the same old same, it is still pretty good. But that finally brings us to the combat section. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that Skyrim has like incredible combat. At best I think it's serviceable for what the game is, and I do think it's gotten better since release given all the additions and everything. But ultimately it comes down to your sort of standard mage, fighter, thief archetypes and everything you can do therein. Now, luckily, as I mentioned earlier, there is a lot you can do there to vary all of this up, but it simply must be said that the traditional sneak archer is simply the most effective way to play this game, and it is not close. Being a sneak archer allows you to, with upgraded hits and multipliers and everything, largely kill enemies completely unseen, while at absolutely zero danger to yourself. In terms of raw effectiveness, it's simply the way to go. But there are other fun ways to play, because we can dual wield. Notably, each hand acts as an equipment slot in terms of weapons and magic. Now, this is a change from the previous magic system, which was assigned to a hotkey, but I actually prefer this. I like actually being able to assign a bit of magic to each hand. And while that does get away with the sort of quick slot casting, what it does set us up for is the favorite system that we have. So this allows us to switch between things on the fly in combat by just bringing up a favorites menu. And you can use that to quickly swap between magic and other items, which is why I don't really care that there's no quick slot personally. But what's more, what I really love about the magic system is that with a appropriate perk, you can dual cast most spells to increase their effect, which is just a really cool system that I like a lot. It's probably worth a mention that when the game originally came out, magic was not something that scaled well into the end game. That is to say, fully maxed out, it just wasn't pumping out the damage of the other play styles. And while I mostly used unarmed for this playthrough, magic is something that can be really strong. Now, however, these days the unarmed playthrough that I ran through this time with is probably the least effective way to play, minus the mods that make it better, of course. But with the Creation Club editions, you can get a lot more spells that let you do even more and actually scale your damage up much, much better than the base game was, which is what is going to allow you to use offensive magic more as a particular play style, like say using destruction magic to attack, without it being such a hassle. Then, of course, there's your standard fighter, your two-handed weapon, your sword and board, that kind of thing. Blocking is a surprisingly really good perk tree. Like, they've got a lot of great stuff in blocking, which is why I actually had to start picking up a shield with my unarmed approach to this, because I wanted to punch out Mirak to finish this run. Or, well, before the Ebony Warrior anyway. But I did notice that I was taking a lot of damage from magical attacks, so I wound up picking up a shield because they get a perk that gives you 50% resistance to most of the magic damage you're going to take, which was really helpful in helping me stay alive, frankly, to compensate for the fact that this unarmed build, which is supported but not exactly your best route, as a way to get through the game. But that's just one example of how you can sort of make things work for you in terms of Skyrim. But realistically, I think when it comes to combat, to get the most out of it, you're really going to have to learn how to weave a whole bunch of interactions into doing really fun stuff. For instance, if you are lacking some particular element to a build, you may very well try to fill that gap with a dragon shout, which you can utilize in combat. Slow time is universally effective for all of them, and I found it to be pretty clutch for finishing off some end-game enemies once my unarmed damage started to fall behind a bit. So again, can you combine all of this stuff into something interesting that suits you is really the question you've got to ask yourself, because otherwise it's basically your standard attack and block while trying to avoid what the enemy's dealing with you. Now that said, the game doesn't have things like an in-game combat dodge to really facilitate what's going on here, which means most of your defense is going to come from using items from your inventory, which there is no real limit on, which is obviously one of the ways that this game is not quite as difficult as you might want it to be, outside of, cranking it up via mods. But again, start looking at those interesting effects. Can I say, turn into a werewolf or a vampire lord to make this more interesting? Can I rope in various effects such as quiet casting from the illusion tree, necromage from the restoration tree? Can I use conjuration to start summoning in help via Atronachs? Can I get to the Twin Souls perk where it'll actually let me have 2 Atronachs with me? Can I utilize a follower? You can also bring followers into combat to help you. Now, I didn't really mention these guys previously because honestly they're just not that super interesting, because none of them really have a story so much, as this was kind of pre them trying to give you proper companions. But there are a whole host of followers. I'd say Serana is the only one of real note. Other times they are just typically associated with a quest or two, and then they can follow you around and help you in combat. And that's one of the ways in which you can sort of offset overwhelming numbers, as an example. But I tell you all of that to basically say this. Is combat in Skyrim like this incredible experience? No, not by a long shot. But if you are willing to play around with the game's various systems, I think you are likely to find something satisfying in relation to how you want to play the game, which is probably in no small part because the focus really does seem to be on making you feel like some incredibly powerful person. And that finally brings us to our DLC section. So this game got 3 DLCs we need to talk about especially, which are Hearthfire, Dawnguard, and Dragonborn. Hearthfire is very basic. You could actually build a house of your own in certain locations. I believe there's 3 of them. And you can customize those homes, and it's also going to let you do things like adopt orphans. You see around up to 2 of them, I believe, though. And that, on top of the game's system for getting married that was already present, if a little basic, kind of lets you form your own little family unit in Skyrim, and it adds a decent amount of gameplay, but it's really nothing to write home about. The big stuff is with Dawnguard and Dragonborn. Dawnguard puts you in contact with the Dawnguard vampire hunters as they are trying to track down the source of the recent spat of vampire attacks which are ultimately emanating from Volkihar Castle. In so doing, we unwittingly wake up Serana, a vampire woman who's been sleeping for a very, very long time, who was tracking down an Elder Scroll for her father before all that happened. This leads you back to Volkihar Castle, where you get a choice to become a vampire lord and go either down the vampire route or the Dawnguard route if you refuse for this DLC. Now, the main story doesn't really change much based on that decision, but there are side activities and things you get access to one way or the other that do change. If you join the Dawnguard, for instance, we can get attack dogs or armored trolls to follow us around, alongside better access to things like the various crossbows that were added here. Whereas if we go the vampire route, we of course get access to the vampire lord form, but also other things that boost that up. We even get potions of blood, so we don't have to feed as much. And then later on, we get to keep Volkihar Castle. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. Now, in terms of questing, it's pretty good, actually. Serana is a great character. She's really the only follower with a proper story, which makes her like the game's only real companion, to be honest, despite the companions being a faction, mind you. But ultimately, you find out through various readings of Elder Scrolls and plots and machinations that Harkon, the leader of the Volkihar vampires, is trying to blot out the sun in typical vampire fashion, and he's going to do this by using the Elder Scrolls to locate an item called Ariel's Bow. This puts you into contact with the last known Falmer, or the Snow Elves, before they actually became Falmer, which is some pretty great lore in and of itself. And then we also get to explore the Forgotten Vale, which is like another little open area added by this DLC, which has all sorts of unique stuff, like a really cool dual dragon fight. One way or another, though, this does end in a fight with, of course, Harkon in his vampire lord form. Although, if you've made it out of the Soul Cairn as part of this DLC, which is honestly not a fun place to explore at all, due to the lack of a map or any real solid idea of where you're going, even if it is a cool place, you can easily beat Harkon if you've got that kind of persistence, I think. But honestly, overall, a pretty cool DLC. I wouldn't say it's like amazing or groundbreaking or anything, but it is fun and it does what Skyrim does well, which is exploration and lore. But then we have Dragonborn, the final bit of DLC, which added like the legendary systems and stuff that I talked about earlier. And this starts by you being attacked by cultists after a certain point in the main story, and you're going to track these cultists down to Solstheim, a previous place that we've explored via DLC for Morrowind. So we get to see that place we've already visited quite some time ago and how it's doing these days. And the answer is not well, because of course nearby Morrowind had the volcanic explosion, which has covered Solstheim in ash. The Dark Elves themselves are having a bad time as a result of that and the Argonians attacking, which means there's a lot of sort of refugee-type settlements going on here where people are just doing their best to get away from everything. And it's a really cool place to sit down and explore. And what's more, we actually get to come back to Raven Rock, which is a town that our character in Morrowind would have founded, which is always a pretty good time. But ultimately, we track down Miraak, who turns out to be the first Dragonborn, fighting you, the last Dragonborn, as he tries to escape the clutches of the Daedric prince Hermaeus Mora, who he made a deal with to sort of escape his fate. It has nonetheless sort of been shackled to it by having to fight you now. He is very powerful as the first Dragonborn, using his forbidden knowledge from Hermaeus Mora. We ultimately have to fight him for the safety of both the island of Solstheim, but also Miraak's wider plans for the world at large, and as a Dragonborn, it's our job to put this guy down. This leads us to brand new shouts, new quests, new activities, all sorts of new equipment that is some of the best stuff you can get, and they even played a lot of fan service to Morrowind at the same time, which has always been a fan favorite, let's be real. So all in all, great bit of DLC. It's a fantastic way to end things, and what's more, beating Miraak at the end of this actually also gives you a kind of way to respec. Bizarrely, after you defeat Miraak, you can go to his Summit of Apocrypha to respec or refund the perks that you've invested into any skill tree without having to, say, legendary it, which is situationally useful, I guess, but overall, very good bit of DLC. I liked it quite a bit. And that, of course, brings us to the Steam Deck section. Like pretty much all the Elder Scrolls games at this point, game is verified on the Steam Deck. It runs very well there. Standard problems you might have in general with getting the game to run if you're having problems with like mods and things like that, but ultimately the Steam Deck is hardware that is much more than the original hardware that Skyrim was built on. And as a result of that, if you just needed confirmation for some reason, yes, it plays very well there. Which brings us to our positives and negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, I think the thing Skyrim does best is exploration, and how that exploration leads into the fantastic lore of the Elder Scrolls series, and occasionally hitting you with a quest that is just a blast. And when those things are done well, it's just a really, really fun time. Which is obviously why Skyrim has done as well as it has, and yet there are some pressing negatives, really. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, for me that comes down to two things: consequences and the pacing. The game has very little consequences. They're just trying to make you do whatever badass thing it feels like you want to do. And the result of that is that it kind of just doesn't really matter what you do because the consequences are practically non-existent. And when you combine that with the fact that the game is constantly trying to rush to the big cool thing, it really sort of undercuts some of the big moments that I think could have been more impactful if you had given them time to actually be impactful. And if I had to describe it in a more digestible way, I would say Skyrim is a book that always wants to jump straight to the end. But it forgets that the ending only really matters because of all of the stuff that leads up to the ending. But that does bring me to my conclusion. Honestly, in total, I really enjoy Skyrim. It's why I've played it as much as I have. I think it has some glaring issues that have only become more and more obvious as it ages, but it also does a few things extremely well, which I think is at least in part why it has experienced the success that it has. But I think that success is also a bit of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, Skyrim is a product of the time in which it released. Plenty of other games have iterated on individual pieces of Skyrim to better effect, and while Skyrim still has them beat in terms of just scale and overall experience, it's a game that is definitely showing its age. And because it's taken them so long to get to the Elder Scrolls 6, which is just now in development, there's simply put no way that game is probably going to reach the, I would say, overwhelming consensus of greatness that the Elder Scrolls 5 here has. While I have no doubt in my mind that the Elder Scrolls 6 will sell extremely well, in order for it to have the same sort of influence that Skyrim has enjoyed, it would just have to absolutely knock so many things out of the park that I just don't think it's going to happen, just from a sort of pragmatic standpoint. But one way or another, it is certainly going to be an event. Though given how people have certainly mythologized and headcanoned what they would even want from a potential Elder Scrolls 6, I just don't see a version of that game that actually lands for enough people for it to be a sort of overwhelming success the way Skyrim was. Because whether you like it or not, as it certainly is aging, Skyrim's success and influence is simply undeniable, which is exactly why people like myself have been making videos that are entirely too long about it for years and years, discussing and getting into individual little topics, because let's be honest, as long as this video is, there are plenty of things that I didn't touch at all or only scratch the surface of, because that is how massive this world is and what keeps people coming back to it. And so while I'll spare you the recommendation on this game, I do think that's as good a place as any to wrap up my thoughts on Skyrim. So hopefully you enjoyed all of that. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.